I'm quite in a reflective mode. It's been quite a year and there's a lot to reflect on. And the point is not to reflect on stuff that you already said, but to process this all and move forward. And the best way I found to wrap up a year is to ask myself, what will I remember this year for? Okay, and beyond the cliches, COVID suddenly became pandemic professionals, fascinating American elections. Fine, but that's not the stuff, that's details. So, for example, let me think about, I'm not alive for that many years, but if I think back to 2001, the year that the towers came down. So, yes, I remember the towers, but I remember the fear. I remember the bursted bubble. Radical religion was gone. Atheism was the future. Terrorism happened in the Middle East. It was a huge perception change. 2008, economic crash. So yes, if you ask me what I remember of that year, I do remember I wasn't married and I'm not a financial guy, but I do remember bailout after collapse of company and banks, etc. But what's the leftover residue? A tremendous amount of despair, despondency, um, anger on CEOs getting their salary raises, a real an awareness that the financial sector and that business is not as um, thought through as I thought they were, whether it was subprime mortgages and all the other ridiculous overlending and overborrowing that were happening in the market. I think back and I sit there saying, wow, like that was a year that the market exploded in our face. When I think back to 2015, 2016 with Brexit and the American election when Trump came in, I think of fake news. I think of radicalism on both sides of the debate. I think of the extreme right and extreme left. I think of the rise of anti-Semitism. Um, Alternative facts. I think of the social media, how till then they were the darlings of everybody, and suddenly they became the enemy when people realized how easy it was to manipulate people. And when I think about 2020, what do I think? I just pointed, and these are not all the major events that happened in the last 20 years. But if I would say that if I had to pinpoint the four biggest events worldwide that have happened in the 21st century, I would put 9/11. I would put the financial crash. I would put the Brexit and American election and all the everything going on in the world at 2015, 2016. And obviously, I would put in COVID. So far, these have been the four most formative events of the world we live in the 21st century. Obviously, there's a lot of formative events that happened before that, before the 21st century, um, whether it is the secularization in the 19th and 20th century, whether it is the 60 revolution, whether it was massive campaigns for equality, Martin Luther King, feminism, homosexuality, gay rights, etc. There's a lot of that's been building up until then. But if you had to tell me, what four most pivotal events happened in the last 20 years, I think you could agree that it's those four, or maybe you would throw in one and take one other out. I can't imagine which one, but that's what we would be dealing with. So what have we learned of this fourth major event and the first truly worldwide event of the 21st century? The American election was huge, but it wasn't worldwide. The economic crash was huge, and it was relatively worldwide, but not everywhere, and different countries affected different ways. And 9/11 was a uniquely American story, although eventually it metamorphosized into two wars and everything else. It was a localized scenario that became a worldwide phenomenon. COVID is an event that affected 7.7 billion people, each one in a unique way, and a transformative event. Now, if you think of the other events, you would think that those are much more dramatic. You would think that 9/11, serious taking down the Twin Towers, or an economic crash and just the collapse of economic institutions are more substantial than a virus that a bat ate that somebody ate a bat in Wuhan, China, just over a year ago. But the fact is that this has affected us more than any other thing, and in the long term. Yes, America went to war, but for most people, it did not affect them that America went to war. It maybe irritated them, it didn't affect them. We've been affected by COVID for 9, 10 months already, and we definitely will be for a few more months. It's definitely a year of our life, if not much more, has been affected by this event. And that's transformative, just like the other events of the 21st century are transformative. The world has never recovered from 9/11, and the world has never recovered from 2008. A lot of the anger that happened in 2016 was birthed in 2008 and was birthed in 9/11 with the anti extremism, or one extreme leading to another extreme. If you just put the picture, it's 20 years of one mega event playing out, let's say every 5 to 6 years, that has huge ramifications in the coming years. So I ask you a simple question. Now that we're wrapping up this, and we're wrapping up 2020, we're wrapping up 20 years, 1/5 of the 21st century. A fifth of a century is quite a bit. If you think about it, a century ago, from 1900 to 1920, gosh, what happened? The virus, the World War I, the collapse of the monarchy in Russia, the rise of communism, mass immigration of Jewish people across the world, etc., etc. A lot happened in the first 20 years, and a lot happened in the next 20 years, etc. 20 years is a serious amount of time. It's a generation in some ways. Some people say a generation is 25 years, but especially now that people are getting married late, the generation might even turn into 30 years. But 20 years is a substantial amount of time. And these 20 years have been unbelievable. Unbelievable. 20 years ago, I'd imagine that none of you had an email address. And if you did, it was very primitive on dial-up internet. Remember, people started only getting email addresses in 94, 95. By 2000, it wasn't the most popular thing. People were slowly getting it. And I'm sure there's many people had email addresses, but think about it. Google was 2 years old. Facebook was non-existent. Twitter was non-existent. Snapchat was not existent. Apple did not give out its first iPhone yet. Nobody really had smartphones. WhatsApp was not invented yet. Neither Zoom. I don't think YouTube was either. And that was just 20 years ago. Just 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Donald Trump was a just coming out of bankruptcy and in Atlantic City, and just a guy that made it onto the tabloids. Barack Obama was a name you never heard of. Al-Qaeda was a word you didn't know. ISIS was non-existent. What else was non-existent? South Africa was 5 years into its democracy. It's a different world. You still called people internationally. It costed you a fortune with phone cards. Flights were not as, people didn't jump around the world as much. It wasn't that different than today, or at least pre-COVID, but it was not exactly the same. Cars were definitely not as cool as they are now. Life was much simpler, less complex. The 90s, there was the big boom. China was a non-issue. Nobody worried about what's the future of China. Russia was coming out of a decade of absolute nothingness. Putin was barely getting elected then, and nobody had a clue that what he would turn Russia into. I could just go on and on and on. 20 years later, China's a superpower. Russia interferes in everybody's elections. ISIS is a reality, and Al-Qaeda is a reality, and terrorism is a reality, and smartphones are reality, and all the technology we discussed is reality, and fake news is reality, and post-truth is reality. Well, you can't say anything's true about post-truth, but the fact is that, just creating alternative facts is reality. The extreme left is more left than it's ever been. The extreme right is more right than it's ever been. Anti-Semitism has gone up. And I'm just focusing not only on, not necessarily on the positive stuff. A lot of positive has happened as well. More people have been taken out of poverty than ever before in history. The population of the world has grown exponentially by at least 1 billion people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's been 20 years, and it's time to reflect. That's what I'm thinking. It's time to reflect. 20 years living in the 21st century. Remember Y2K? The paranoia people had, what's going to happen when you move into the year 2000? Are all computers going to crash? Some people were hiding out in bunkers and, claiming that they heard messages from on high, blah, blah, blah. It's 20 years later. The world is much more tech savvy, and the world is much more confused. With all the knowledge we have in our fingertips, oh, that's another point I didn't bring up. We have access to knowledge in the last 20 years that more access in one person's hand than most people, that all humanity had collectively. In other words, right now you go on Google, you could access anything. That's their mission statement, to gather all the world's knowledge. We have Wikipedia, we have incredible access to information, and yet, are we a wiser generation before? I would argue absolutely not. We're more confused, anxious, generation than ever before. In a world that was supposed to give us the tools to become modern people, we have the technology and we have the access to knowledge and we have the medical advances. In the world that we have objectively, in other words, compared to what our grandparents had, you would think that 20 years down the line of this 21st century, we would have advanced. And yet, I would say in almost every single area, and I'm not a pessimist, and maybe I'm just in a bad mood today. I'm not, but maybe I am. Um, I would say in every area of human maturity, if we haven't regressed, we definitely haven't progressed. We're not more in control of our emotions. We're not better behaved. We're not more sophisticated and educated. And I'm not talking about education as in maths and degrees. I'm saying, like, being a mensch. We're not more tolerant. We're not more, our marriages aren't that, the truth is, I actually say that our marriages these days are a little better than they were in the 90s, because now, like, the kids learn from their parents' mistake. But we're far from, a great scenario. We haven't really progressed. Parents raising their kids, drugs, opioid addiction, alcoholism. You have to ask yourself a simple question. What is up with the human being? After 20 years of such incredible progress. And yes, as we mentioned, 4 major world events, if not more. Where is wisdom? Where is the reflection of the world? Where is the analysis where the world comes and asks itself, what have we done? I was reading a fascinating review that Chief Rabbi Sachs wrote 2014. He wrote a review on somebody's book that was published by Yale University Press. And he said, interestingly, he says, religion has had to confront its dark areas. He talks about the church that had to confront some of its dark past. He says, and yet modernism or atheism has not confronted its past. In other words, I do not see, and neither do you see, a reflection on behalf of the world's elite and educated to come and say, you know what, with all our advancements of society and with all our sophistication that we've brought in since the Renaissance, have we made the world a better place? Yes, in some areas they have, but where has secularism taken us? Where has atheism taken us? Has it taken accountability of the fact that atheists, not people, individuals, I'm saying the ideology of atheism combined with other ideologies has collectively killed way over 100 million people just in the last 100 years? Communist Russia, Communist China, Nazism, fascism, Cambodia, Rwanda. This wasn't religion. Religion has also had issues, but let's be honest. Religion is the first one to sit there saying that they don't condone extremism. Has the world, have you, me, have we asked ourselves, with all our fancy schmancy ideas and all our sophistication and all our self-help, have we made life better for our kids than they had 100 years ago? Yes, maybe now they all have access to indoor toilets, but, but have we made life better? Have human beings had an upgraded quality of life, not physically, emotionally, from a place of love and wisdom? Is the human being a more mature human being than he was 200 years ago, 300 years ago? I don't know. I'm not convinced. Like this, I recommend you should read it. The last book Chief Rabbi Sachs gave out, Morality. He gives a fascinating analysis of the last few hundred years, pretty much ever since the Renaissance and even before that, with the big modern ideas of the market and the sciences. And obviously he was a proud academic. He has nothing against it, but he sees the fact that they tried to take over the space of religion instead of saying we have our own space, but we're not going to take over theology. They did try to take over theology, and they try to tell us that there is no God and the world has no essential meaning. And like, I don't know, have we made the human being happy? Yes. Like I think about, for example, the smartphone. Has a smartphone come with incredible benefits? Yes. I get to talk with my family every day. WhatsApp's incredible. But has it upgraded my inner peace and serenity and quality of life and wisdom? No. I cannot tell you how every single day I become more and more aware of such hectic stuff going on in people's lives. And yes, some of it is not their fault. It's not. I mean, to this, is anything really anybody's fault? But some of it does not come from people's bad decisions. It just comes from their bad muzzle, whatever. They just, like, that's their life. But most of what I deal with are people who are not wise enough to make clever decisions, to make the right decision about who to marry. Like, seriously, did you really think that that was a good marriage? Bad decisions about how to parent kids. Really? Did you think that, causing havoc with every teacher and every principal of your kid is going to help them grow well, et cetera, et cetera? Common sense stuff. Exposing your kid, giving your kid a phone without any limitations, allowing your kid to go in the most dingiest of places just because you trust them. Like, really? What were you thinking? And this is the kind of stuff, like, after 20 years in this 21st century, like, have we figured things out? Like, yeah, I don't know. As I'm talking to you, I just think that in so many ways, we're dumber than we've ever been. And common sense is less and less common. And this is across the world. I'm not going to say that religious people have it have it better. On the contrary, in certain areas, I would say not. Because again, religion is not necessarily always the answer. It's the mindfulness. It's the God focus. It's the morality that sets us apart. And religion helps that if you remember what religion's there to do. If religion just becomes a practice, it does help in certain areas, but it doesn't solve anything. You could still be a very firm person and be totally post-truth and other stuff, and just like buy into nonsense and think that the American election is the single most important thing in your lifetime, while it isn't. And I know if this video ever comes out and somebody sees that, I could just imagine 5,000 nasty comments coming out. How dare he? Who does he think he is? And that's exactly the point. And yes, COVID was a nice grand slam for the end of the first the first score, whatever it's called. Yes, score is 20 years. The first fifth of the 21st century wrapped up with a nice bang with COVID. But in many ways, COVID was supposed to be, I'm not saying that's why God does it, but it could have been a mirror for us to look back, force us, being locked down in our house, to look back at the last 20 years, 100 years, and ask ourselves, no, there's no way to translate new, but new, what's going on? Have we figured it out? And yes, there was a stage at the beginning of the year that we became a bit reflective, but by now we're going back. We're all going on holiday, we're going back. And we're going back, straight back to the last 20 years. Continuing the same life that brought us the last 20 years. And I ask you a simple question. What has the last 20 years brought you? And which parts of it brought you goodness and blessing and serenity, and which parts didn't? Like, at the end of such a substantial amount of time, end of a decade as well, time we ask ourselves, okay, what's happened in the last 10, 20 years? And do I want the third decade, my 20s, the 20s, till now when you refer to the 20s, you're referring to the roaring 20s, 100 years ago. Now we're entering the 20s. It's like 100 years ago. What do I want my 20s to look like? The third decade of the 21st century. What do I want this decade to look like? What's my dreams? I can't control what major events are going to happen in the world, but what do I want for myself? What do I want to see? And what do I need to do to get there? Please God, each person should be, each of us should be alive and healthy in 10 years' time. 10 years is a long time, and it's a short time. What do you want to look like in 2030? Just 10 more years of experiences, 10 more years of sitcoms, 10 more years of posting on Facebook, 10 more years of what? Will it be 10 more years of wisdom? Will it be 10 more years of growth, maturity, love, impact, generosity, curiosity? Or what will it be? What will the next 20 years look like? Next 10 years. And I really hope that that's what we spend our time in this December and January as we transfer into a new decade. Truth is, we really started the decade a year ago, but whatever, in the minds, 2021 is the beginning of a new decade. What's it going to look like? Remember, it's only been 20 years since you've heard of Al-Qaeda, and 20 years, less than 20 years, since almost everything that consumes your life right now. Think about it. How much time in your life you spend these days on social media, on Netflix, on your smartphone? That didn't exist. So much of what consumes your day now didn't exist 20 years ago. Yeah, TV, whatever. So that's my question. You have 10 years left. Please God, the next 10 years should be years of true growth and depth and wisdom. Thank you, Tracy. And please God, we should only